Imagine standing at the edge of a medieval village. The year is 1352. The air smells of wood smoke and wet hay. A thin fog rolls over fields that have long forgotten the sound of laughter. In one cottage, a woman kneels beside a dying fire, her hands blackened with soot as she turns a small loaf of bread, the only meal her family will have tonight. A few miles away, inside a great stone castle, servants rush beneath chandeliers of dripping wax, preparing silver platters piled high with roasted meat, golden pies, and crimson wine. Two worlds divided not just by walls, but by hunger itself. This was the kitchen of the Middle Ages, a world where food was never simply food. It was faith and class, and power served one bite at a time. Some ate to live, others feasted to rule, and between them lay the silence of those who had nothing to eat at all. If that sounds like your kind of weird history, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy these quiet little journeys into forgotten worlds. And drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. It's oddly comforting to know who else is wandering through the night with us, one story at a time. Tonight, we travel back to that world where every crumb tells a story and every table, rich or poor, reflects the soul of an age. Welcome to Why Did the Poor Starve While Kings Feasted? Welcome to the medieval kitchen. The smell of bread and smoke, the dawn comes quietly over the thatched roofs of a forgotten village. It is winter, the kind that bites through wool and faith alike. The ground is hard with frost. The air carries a thin veil of wood smoke, sharp, cold, and strangely sweet. Only a few chimneys breathe. Most houses stand dark, for their hearths have nothing left to burn. In one, a woman stirs beside a dying fire, her hands raw from gathering twigs and straw, trying to coax life from embers that no longer care. The light that slips through the cracks of her cottage is gray, not golden. On the table lies a single loaf of bread, coarse, dark, and small. It is yesterday's bread and the day before's hardened to stone. But tonight, it will be softened in water, blessed with a whisper of salt, and called supper. Outside, a rooster cries, unaware that hunger listens too. This was the world of the medieval kitchen, where food was not merely sustenance, but a language of power, faith, and survival. Every meal, from the humblest bowl of pottage to the grandest banquet, told the story of who one was and who one could never be. The woman by the fire, her name is forgotten, as are most who live like her. She is the mother of 6, though 2 are already gone. Her husband works the Lord's fields, where the soil belongs to God, the crop to the noble, and only the weeds are free. Each morning she kneels before a wooden cross on the wall, whispers a prayer not for abundance, but for enough to last the night, enough to keep the children quiet, enough to keep hope from freezing. She cuts the loaf with a dull knife. The crust cracks like old leather. The crumbs that fall are swept into her palm, none are wasted. In this small act lies a quiet faith, as deep as any cathedral's hymn. A mile away, beyond the smoke and the cold, stands another kitchen larger than her house, louder than her prayers. Here, the air is thick with the scent of roasted meat and spiced wine. Firelight dances across the walls of stone, and the sound of laughter echoes from the great hall above. Servants hurry, sleeves rolled, faces flushed from heat and fear. Copper pots bubble, knives flash, and every dish must be perfect. For the feast is not just about hunger, it is about glory. At the top of the castle, the Lord awaits. His table is long enough to seat a dozen knights, and his appetite longer still. He eats not to live, but to be seen living, to show that he has triumphed over the hunger that haunts the land. Between these two fires, the dying hearth of the peasant and the roaring flame of the noble, lies the story of the Middle Ages, a world where food was destiny, To eat white bread instead of black was to declare one's blood pure. To drink wine instead of ale was to show one's soul refined. And to go hungry was not just misfortune, it was a sign of divine judgment, proof that God had chosen others. Yet hunger was the great equalizer. The noble might feast, but he feared poison in his cup. The peasant might starve, but he feared nothing, for there was nothing left to take. In the Middle Ages, the kitchen was the heart of existence, both a place of warmth and of punishment. The flame that cooked your food could also burn your soul. It was here that religion, class, and survival met, clashing in the smoke and the scent of bread. Bread, the simplest and most sacred of all foods. In it lay the body of Christ, the labor of the poor, and the pride of the rich. Every crumb carried meaning. To break it was an act of grace. To waste it, a sin. It was said that a good Christian never threw away a piece of bread, even the smallest crust. He would kiss it, lift it to his forehead, and return it to the earth. For to waste bread was to offend the miracle that made it. And yet, across Europe, millions went without it. When harvests failed, as they often did, the fields became graves of hope. People ground bark, acorns, even straw into their dough. Bread turned black, bitter, and moldy, but still they called it bread. In contrast, the feast of the nobles was a theater of excess. Whole animals roasted, golden pastries, rivers of wine. Dishes carried not names, but titles. The swan of St. George, the peacock of glory. The guests ate beneath tapestries that showed saints and battles, as though holiness and hunger could share the same table. Each course was more extravagant than the last. Not for taste, but for spectacle. The Lord would tear the leg of a roasted boar with his jeweled hands, and the minstrels would sing. Candles burned, grease dripped, and laughter rolled like thunder. Outside, in the snow, a child pressed his face against the wall, smelling what he would never taste. History remembers kings and battles, but seldom the kitchens that fed them. Yet it is here, amid fire and hunger, that the soul of an age reveals itself. The kitchen is a confessional. It tells truths that cathedrals hide and chronicles ignore. It speaks of women who stirred pots with one hand and rocked infants with the other, of men who risked their lives to steal a loaf, of monks who fasted to purify the flesh, and lords who gorged to forget their fear of death. Food was faith. Food was politics. Food was survival. A loaf could be the difference between salvation and sin. A feast could crown a king or kill him. And the empty bowl, that silent witness, spoke louder than all. As dawn brightens, the woman in the cottage feeds the fire one last twig. Her children still sleep, huddled together like birds in a nest. She slices the bread, divides it carefully, and sets aside the smallest piece. Tomorrow she hopes there will be more. But hope, like flour, is easily used up. She looks out the window, smoke rising from the castle hill, and whispers, not in envy, but in wonder, how is it that God's children eat so differently? Centuries later, that question still lingers in the air, rising with the smell of bread and smoke. Why did the poor starve while kings feasted? Why did one man's hunger sanctify another's abundance? Why was food the simplest human need turned into the sharpest tool of power? Perhaps the answer lies not in the feast or the famines themselves, but in what they reveal about us, our fears, our faith, and our endless hunger for meaning. In the Middle Ages, what one ate was not just a matter of taste, it was a declaration of who they were. To eat was to belong or to be forgotten. To feast was to be seen. To starve, to disappear. And somewhere between these two, between the banquet and the hunger, humanity learned the oldest lesson of all, that what fills the stomach does not always fill the soul. So tonight, as we travel back through kitchens of stone and cottages of smoke, we will follow the path of bread from the hands that baked it in darkness to the tables where it was broken in light. We will see how the simple act of eating shaped faith, forged class, and mirrored the beating heart of civilization. This is not just a story of food, it is a story of power, of mercy, of survival, a story of how we became who we are through hunger and through hope. Welcome to the medieval kitchen. Welcome to the age when bread ruled the world. The poor man's table, bread and ashes. The day begins not with sunrise, but with hunger. In a small cottage on the edge of a field, before the roosters cry and the frost has melted, a woman wakes to the cold breath of winter pressing against her skin. Her first thought is not of prayer, nor of work, but of bread. Bread, the oldest, humblest promise of survival. In this world, it is everything: food, faith, and fortune. Yet for most, it is a miracle seldom granted. The peasant's bread was nothing like the soft white loaves that graced the tables of the rich. It was dark and dense, made not of pure wheat but of what the earth reluctantly offered: rye, barley, oats, millet, or sometimes ground acorns when the harvest failed. The dough was heavy, rough beneath the hands that kneaded it, hands hardened by fieldwork, cracked by cold, stained by soil. When baked, it emerged from the oven like a small stone, its crust as black as the smoke that filled the air. It did not smell sweet, it smelled of earth, of ash, of necessity. To chew it was to remember labor, to taste the bitterness of survival itself. And yet, for all its coarseness, that bread was sacred. A loaf meant one more day lived, one more dawn seen, one more child quieted before sleep. There was little talk at the poor man's table. Words, like bread, were rationed. When mealtime came, often after long hours in the fields or forests, the family gathered around the wooden board that served as both table and altar. The father, if present, sat at the head, though he ate last. The mother cut the bread. The children watched. No plates, no knives, no wine, only a loaf, a bowl of thin pottage, and a wooden spoon that passed from hand to hand. They ate in silence, save for the scrape of spoon on wood and the low breath of gratitude whispered between bites. It was said that in poor homes every crumb was blessed before it was swallowed, a prayer not of thanks but of endurance. Lord, grant that tomorrow we may still eat. Her name is unknown, but her image survives in 1,000 villages. In every century of hardship, she sits by the fire, a child on her lap, 5 more asleep in the shadows. Her hair is dull with soot. Her face carries the lines of both hunger and habit. On the table before her lies a small round loaf. She touches it gently, as one might touch a relic. It is yesterday's bread, baked from barley and a handful of acorn meal. The crust is cracked, and a bloom of pale mold crawls along its edge. She knows it must last another day. Her husband has not returned. He is working the Lord's land, or perhaps he has fallen ill. She listens for footsteps outside, but hears only the wind. One by one, the children stir. Their faces are thin, their eyes too large. They do not speak. Hunger has taught them silence. The mother takes a knife, its blade dull and blackened by years of use. She makes the sign of the cross above the loaf, then begins to cut. 1 slice, 2, 3, 6. The pieces are small, barely more than a breath. She dips them in a pot of warm water, thickened with a trace of old broth, then lays them out on wooden bowls. No one moves until she bows her head. Bless this bread, Lord, she murmurs. Then, only then, they eat. The youngest chews slowly, savoring every crumb as though it were feast day cake. The eldest breaks her piece in two and hides half beneath the table for later. When they are done, the mother gathers what remains, a fragment no larger than her thumb, and places it on the windowsill. For the birds, even the sparrows, must eat. To the medieval poor, bread was not simply food, it was the body of God. The priest spoke of it each Sunday, raising a white host before the altar. But for those who rarely saw such whiteness outside of dreams, the holy bread of Mass felt almost like a myth, something for heaven, not for earth. Still, the symbol endured. Each meal began with a cross drawn in the air, a whispered prayer, and the same reverence one gave to the Eucharist. For if Christ could be broken and shared, so too could this loaf. If his body brought salvation, perhaps this crust could bring survival. The poor learned to find divinity in the ordinary, in the warmth of an oven, in the scent of yeast, in the miracle that flour and water could still rise despite all odds. And when famine came, as it often did, they did not curse God. They prayed harder. They prayed that he might see them, that he might taste their hunger and remember mercy. Hunger was not an event. It was a season, sometimes a lifetime. It arrived quietly, like winter fog, and left only when the land had mercy. In the years of bad harvest, the hungry years, as the chroniclers called them, even weeds became food. Women boiled nettles and dock leaves, scraped moss from stones, ground chestnuts, and bark into flour. The bread that came from such things was dark and bitter, the kind that clung to the teeth and turned the stomach, but still they ate. There were times when the bakers' ovens in the village stood cold, for there was no grain to grind. The people would gather at the church steps, eyes hollow, waiting for the priest to open the poor box, a wooden chest that held coins for bread. But the chest was often empty, and so they waited anyway, because hope, like hunger, does not listen to reason. In the manorial world, grain was life, and it belonged to the Lord. The peasants tilled the soil, sowed the seeds, harvested the crop, but much of what they reaped was not theirs. A portion went to rent, another to tithes, another to taxes, and what remained barely filled their own bins. It was said that the poor man's bread was baked with ashes, not out of poetry, but truth. To stretch the flour, they mixed in dust from the hearth, or scraped the sides of the oven for what clung there. It gave the bread a gray tint and a taste of smoke, bitter yet strangely comforting. And so, when a nobleman's carriage rolled past, throwing mud on their faces, the peasants did not bow out of respect, but habit. They knew the hand that fed them was the same that took the grain. When famine came, and it always came, people turned to miracles. In France, they prayed to Saint Honoré, patron of bakers. In England, they left offerings of grain before statues of Mary. In Italy, they baked loaves shaped like crosses and hung them above doors, believing they could ward off starvation. But prayers were not always answered. The hungry learned to make rituals of endurance. They fasted because they had no choice, and called it piety. They shared because to eat alone was a sin against the starving. And when a loaf molded before it could be finished, they scraped off the green and blessed the rest. To eat moldy bread was not shame. It was gratitude. For even decay was a kind of life. Once a week, if the weather held, the village women would gather at the communal oven. Each carried her small lump of dough wrapped in cloth, the sum of her labor, her prayer, her hope. They would mark their loaves with symbols, a cross, a flower, a single line, so that when the bread came out, they might know which miracle was theirs. The oven keeper stoked the fire with straw and branches, while children waited outside, sniffing the air that promised warmth and fullness. When the loaves emerged, steaming and cracked, the women smiled not because they were full, but because for one moment, the world still worked, fire still burned, bread still rose, life still held its fragile rhythm. They would carry the loaves home in their aprons, clutching them as if they were infants. And for that day, the village would smell of something beautiful, not perfume or incense, but bread. Bread was more than sustenance. It was identity. The color of your loaf told the world who you were. The rich ate white bread made of fine wheat flour, sifted until it shone like snow. The poor ate brown or black, made from grains too coarse for refinement. To serve white bread at a table was to proclaim wealth. To serve dark bread was to confess poverty. And yet, the poor found pride in their loaves. They said it was more honest, more real bread that bore the mark of the earth itself. For the noble, bread was a servant. For the peasant, it was a god. Before every meal, even the humblest, the poor bowed their heads, not in ritual obedience, but in gratitude that the day had not ended in emptiness. The mother whispered a short prayer as she placed the bread before her children. Lord, you broke bread for the hungry. Bless this loaf for us. You fed thousands with crumbs. Feed us with hope. Then she would lift the bread to her lips, kiss it, and pass it on. Even when the bread was moldy, the prayer did not change. Faith was not a matter of taste. It was a matter of endurance. To be hungry is to live in constant negotiation with despair. You measure time not in hours, but in meals. You think not of tomorrow, but of the next bite. The poor of the Middle Ages carried this hunger like a second shadow. It shaped their backs, hollowed their cheeks, and deepened their prayers. And yet, it gave them something the rich could never know, the ability to find grace in the smallest gift. A crumb, a crust, a moment of warmth. They learned that holiness could live in hunger, that even an empty stomach could praise God. Evening comes. The fire is nearly out. The mother cuts the final slice from the loaf. It is small, barely enough for one. She gives it to the youngest, who eats slowly, eyes closed. When he is done, she gathers the crumbs, sweeps them into her palm, and carries them to the door. Outside, the snow has begun to fall. She opens her hand. The wind takes the crumbs, scattering them into darkness. In that moment, the line between prayer and hunger disappears. The bread has done its work. It has fed, and it has blessed. Its steam fades into the cold air, rising like incense. In this world, the poor man's table was not a place of feasting, but of faith. Each meal was a small resurrection. A daily miracle wrested from the indifference of the earth. To eat was to defy despair. To bake was to believe in tomorrow. And though history rarely remembers their names, it was these hands, these humble, hungering hands that kept the fire of humanity alive through centuries of famine and fear. Bread and ashes, that was their communion. And from that communion, civilization endured. The peasant's pot, broth, roots, and smoke. The heart of a poor man's home was not its bed nor its table, but the pot. A single blackened iron pot hung from a hook above the fire, its sides polished not by care, but by time and smoke. It was never empty, not truly. Even when it held nothing but cloudy water and a dream of flavor, it waited like an old friend, patient and warm. Everything in a peasant's life passed through that pot: work, prayer, hunger, hope. It was their hearth, their altar, their small and steady miracle. In the cold months, which were most months, the fire never died. Even when the family slept, embers glowed under the ashes, nursed through the night by the mother's hand. Each dawn, she would stir the coals with a stick, blow gently, coaxing life from red dust. A wisp of smoke would rise, and with it, the day began. The fire gave light, warmth, and breath to the home. Above it, the iron pot hung from a crooked chain, black with soot, the air around it thick with the scent of smoke and cabbage. The family gathered close, not for comfort, but for heat. Children sat cross-legged, their faces lit orange by the fire's flicker. The father mended tools, the mother chopped roots on a wooden board. The pot hissed, bubbled, sighed. It was the sound of survival. Forget feasts and roasts, those belong to castles. For the peasant, the meal was modest, predictable, and endlessly repeated. Onions, leeks, turnips, cabbage, and whatever herbs grew wild along the path. Sometimes a few beans, sometimes peas, sometimes a bone, gnawed clean from the Lord's table, boiled again for what flavor might still cling to it. The smell was sharp and green, earthy and plain. No spices, except perhaps a pinch of salt if fortune allowed. Pepper was for the rich. For the poor, flavor was memory. They called it pottage the poor man's stew. It was not a dish, but a life. Every household had its own pot and its own way of filling it. There was no recipe, only rhythm. Into the pot went what the earth gave: roots from the field, greens from the garden, herbs from the hedgerow, sometimes barley or oats to thicken it, sometimes stale bread crumbled in to make it seem more. It cooked slowly, all day, absorbing the smoke, the wood, the waiting. When ready, it was ladled into wooden bowls, a grayish broth thick with vegetables, sometimes with nothing but shadows floating in it. And yet, the first spoonful was always taken with reverence, because even a thin broth was proof that life had not yet given up. The peasant's pot was rarely washed clean. When one meal ended, the leftovers stayed. The next day, more roots and water were added and the pot bubbled again. Thus, each meal carried the ghost of the last, a continuous line of sustenance, stretching from day to day, sometimes for weeks. They called it perpetual pottage. In its depths, you could taste time itself, the memory of old turnips, the sweetness of a long vanished carrot, the smoke of every night that came before. Nothing was wasted. To waste was sin. Bones were boiled until they dissolved. Herb stalks, peelings, crusts, all found their way into the pot. Even the water used to rinse the bowl was poured back in, to capture whatever strength might remain. It was not cuisine, it was endurance, rendered edible. Morning began with hunger. The children woke before dawn, drawn by the scent of smoke. Their breath misted in the cold air as they huddled near the fire, waiting for the pot to stir. The mother lifted the lid, scooped a ladleful of thin broth into each bowl. No meat, no bread, just warmth. Eat and be thankful, she said softly. Then they went to work. The fields, the animals, the Lord's lands. Hours passed under gray skies. Lunch was not a meal, but a pause, a crust of yesterday's bread, perhaps dipped in cold pottage carried in a jar. At sunset, they returned, faces streaked with dirt and sweat. The pot was waiting thick again with roots and herbs. This time, maybe a miracle. A scrap of bacon, a piece of fat bought from a neighbor, a handful of beans saved for winter. They gathered around the fire once more. The father tasted first, nodded once, and passed the ladle. No words were spoken. In silence, they ate. In silence, they survived. For the poor, waste was unthinkable. Every leaf, every bone, every grain of salt mattered. When the pottage cooled, the mother skimmed off the thin layer of fat precious as gold. It would be saved for the next meal, or rubbed on boots to keep out the rain. When a cabbage leaf fell into the ashes, she brushed it off and tossed it back in. Ashes were flavor too, and besides, they cleansed the pot. Even the fire's smoke had its purpose. It dried herbs, cured meat, blackened walls against insects. It made the cottage smell of living. To the rich, this life would seem pitiful, but to those who lived it, it was sacred economy, a conversation with the earth itself, where nothing was taken without giving something back. Hunger was not an enemy. It was a rhythm. It came and went with the seasons, like the rain. In summer, the pot was green, full of leeks, herbs, and tender roots. In autumn, it grew heavy with turnips, beans, and barley. In winter, it thinned again, its contents pale and few. By spring, when the stores ran out, the pottage became a watery memory. flavored only by hope. They called it the hungry gap, the cruel months between harvests, when even weeds had yet to grow. But still, the pot boiled. Even if it was only water and salt, it boiled. Because to stop cooking was to surrender, and the poor did not surrender. The peasant's pot was not only food but medicine. The women knew which herbs could soothe a cough, which leaves eased a fever, which roots gave strength to the weary. Parsley, sage, thyme, and marjoram, if they could afford to grow them. Nettles, sorrel, and dandelion, if they could not. These were not flavors of luxury, but of endurance. Every green leaf carried a story of healing, of patience, of a people who survived not because they were strong, but because they learned what the earth would give and how to make it last. Keep the pot warm, she would tell her daughters. It remembers us. There was truth in it. The iron pot carried their scent, their hands, their history. Each scratch and scorch mark was a chapter. Each meal was a prayer written in steam. When a child cried from hunger, the mother did not promise plenty. She promised the pot. Tomorrow we'll add more. Tomorrow it will be thicker. Hope, like broth, was thin, but it was enough to live on. The smoke of the hearth was both comfort and curse. It filled the air, stung the eyes, coated every beam and wall. It turned the thatch above black and the lungs beneath weak. But it also preserved them the walls, the meat, the memories. That smoke curled around their days like a shawl. It wrapped the family in its scent, so that even when they walked to the fields, the smell of home followed them. To be without smoke was to be without life. An unlit hearth was a death sentence. If you had tasted their pottage, thin, bitter, sometimes sour, you might have pitied them. But the peasants themselves did not pity. They were proud of their endurance. Each spoonful was a victory, a proof that they still stood against the cold. It was not about flavor. It was about faith in their own hands, in the turning of the seasons, in the belief that tomorrow might bring one more root, one more scrap, one more breath. And so they ate slowly, gratefully. The pot fed their bodies, the fire fed their will. In the poorest homes, there was no bowl for each. One pot, one spoon, one circle of hands. The father took the first spoonful and blew on it. Then he passed it to the mother, then to the eldest, and so on down to the youngest. Each took what they needed and left what they could. In that circle of smoke and silence, the act of eating became an act of communion, a quiet ceremony, older than any church. No one left the fire hungry, though no one left it full. They had eaten together, and that was enough. Before sleeping, the mother always stirred the pot one last time. She whispered to it, "Rest now and feed us again." Ugh. The fire dimmed, the cottage darkened. Outside, the wind carried the scent of ash and herbs into the night. In the silence, one could almost hear the rhythm of gratitude, the heartbeat of a life that refused to break. For in that small, smoky room, with its blackened walls and bubbling pot, there lived something eternal, the resilience of the human spirit. The pot still hangs above the fire. The broth simmers, slow and steady, a whisper of roots and smoke rising to the beams above. The children sleep, the parents rest. The night deepens. In that fragile warmth, one truth remained clear. That survival is not made of gold or grandeur, but of small hands stirring an old pot, believing that tomorrow it will still boil. The church's taste, faith, and fasting. There is a sound that marked every day in the Middle Ages. Not the market cry, not the blacksmith's hammer, but the toll of the church bell. It called the peasants from the fields, the monks from their sleep, and even the lords from their feast, reminding them all that above hunger, above power, there was faith. Faith that reached into every part of life, even the kitchen. To eat was never a private act in the Middle Ages. Every mouthful was watched by God, by priest, by conscience. The church ruled not only souls but stomachs. It told people what to eat, when to eat, and why to stop. Nearly half the year was given to fasting not out of scarcity, but obedience. No meat on Fridays, no animal fat in Lent, no feasting before holy days. No eating at all between sunrise and sunset on certain days of penitence. For the faithful, food was not just nourishment, it was a test. To resist hunger was to imitate Christ. To give in was to taste sin. And so, the calendar itself became a recipe for holiness, a rhythm of feast and famine sanctified by bells. In the monasteries, where men sought to live closer to God, the kitchen was a place of both discipline and temptation. The monks rose before dawn, their prayers echoing down corridors colder than any winter field. After matins came silence, and then the work of the day. Tending gardens, copying scriptures, feeding the hungry, feeding themselves. Their meals were taken in quiet. The refectory, the monks' dining hall, was not a place of chatter, but of reflection. As they ate, one brother read aloud from the scriptures, the voice of God mingling with the sound of spoons on wooden bowls. The food was plain, vegetables from their gardens, beans and lentils, black bread, cheese, sometimes fish from the monastery pond. Meat was forbidden except for the sick, and even then it was eaten behind a curtain so that those in health would not be tempted. Fish, the food of fasting, the symbol of Christ. When the church forbade flesh, the rivers and seas became holy. From trout to eel, from herring to carp, fish filled the gap left by forbidden meat. Every monastery had its pond, every village, its fishermen, and every Friday the smell of salted fish rose like incense across the land. For the rich, it was an opportunity for luxury, a sturgeon stuffed with spices, a salmon gilded with saffron. For the poor, it was whatever could be caught or traded, dried, smoked, salted beyond recognition. And yet both would eat with the same prayer. May this meal cleanse my soul, not corrupt it. Faith transformed hunger into virtue, and fasting into proof of devotion. The church saw food as a mirror of the soul. To eat without restraint was to fall like Adam. To fast was to climb toward Eden again. Gluttony, they preached, is the gateway to all sin. Haunted. In the great sermons, the body was described as a beast and appetite, its reins. To control one's hunger was to tame the flesh. To indulge it was to become the animal one feared. It was not hunger itself that condemned, but desire. To eat with pleasure was dangerous, because pleasure led to pride, and pride was death. And yet, even as the church preached restraint, its own tables groaned with abundance. In cathedrals and abbeys, bishops dined beneath stained glass that told stories of the poor. Golden chalices clinked with wine. Roasted swans were served beside silver crucifixes. They spoke of sacrifice with their mouths still full. The irony was not lost on those who watched from outside the walls. While peasants ate ashes, the men of God feasted and called it ceremony. They justified it by symbolism, that their feast honored the Lord, that abundance reflected divine glory. But beneath the hymns and the Latin prayers, the smell of roasted flesh spoke another language, one of contradiction and quiet hunger for the world they renounced. Silence was the law of the refectory. No laughter, no speech. The spoon was the only voice allowed. But in that silence, the mind spoke loudly. A monk might gaze into his bowl of lentils and imagine the taste of roast goose he had renounced. Temptation lived even here in the smell of garlic, the color of honey, the memory of feasts long gone. They called it gula spiritualis, spiritual gluttony, the sin of thinking of pleasure while appearing to fast. And so, monks disciplined not just the body, but the imagination itself. They fasted not only from food, but from desire. To eat was to pray. The table was an altar, the meal, a sacrament of humility. Every act had meaning. The breaking of bread recalled the Last Supper, the sharing of wine, Christ's blood. Even the simplest meal, a crust and a bowl of broth, was transformed into devotion by intention. Before eating, they bowed their heads. Bless us, O Lord, in these thy gifts. The words turned hunger into holiness, as though grace itself could flavor the blandness of lentils. Fasting was more than faith, it was authority. The church held control not only through prayer, but through the stomach. To define when others could eat was to define how they lived. Every fast day was a reminder that the church's word ruled over the body. It shaped the rhythm of labor and rest, the pulse of the year itself. Even kings knelt before this calendar. No feast could defy Lent, no appetite could outweigh doctrine. The church had turned hunger into law, and through that law, it fed on obedience. For the poor, fasting was nothing new. They lived it, even when it was not commanded. Yet the church demanded that they choose hunger as though the lack of bread could become virtue if baptized by faith. Peasants knelt before their empty bowls and thanked God for the test. They believed that each pang of hunger brought them closer to heaven, and perhaps in their silence, they were closer to grace than the bishops who dined on fish behind golden doors. When bishops feasted, they called it celebration. When peasants ate too much, it was gluttony. The double standard gleamed like a chalice bright on the outside, hollow within. Medieval chroniclers tell of abbots whose kitchens rivaled kings, whose tables saw pheasant, peacock, spiced wines, and sugared almonds. They justified it with words of theology, that beauty honored God, that generosity reflected divine bounty. And yet, the poor could smell the contradiction. While they boiled nettles in silence, the bells rang for another bishop's banquet. Faith, it seemed, had a taste, and it was not always holy. Still, within this tension lay the deepest truth of the age, that food was both sin and salvation. It could damn through greed, indulgence, and pride, but it could also save through fasting, sharing, and grace. A meal could make a man fall or lift him toward heaven. Each crumb, each sip was a choice. To eat was to declare one's allegiance to the flesh or to the spirit. This was the theology of hunger, that salvation was not won in temples, but in the kitchen. Imagine a monk sitting before his bowl. Steam rises, carrying the scent of lentils and leeks. He lifts the spoon slowly, his hand trembling from fasting. Each swallow is both penance and prayer. Each taste, a reminder of what he denies. Outside, peasants eat the same not for faith, but for lack. Inside, he eats for faith, and still feels the same emptiness. Perhaps, beneath the robes and rituals, the hunger of both is one and the same. The church spoke of spiritual hunger, the longing for divine truth. But for most, hunger was not spiritual, it was real. And yet, somehow, it bound them together. The monk fasting in his cell, the peasant praying over his crust, both looked upward as they ate. Both whispered the same words. Give us this day our daily bread. The prayer was universal, its beauty cruel, for some had bread and others only the prayer. In the monastery kitchen, the fire burns low. A monk ladles out the last of the day's broth. Thin, gray, faintly warm. He places it on the wooden table, bows his head, and crosses himself. The silence of centuries gathers in that room, the silence of faith, of discipline, of quiet hunger. Outside, the world feasts and starves. Inside, the church prays and eats, believing that somewhere between flesh and spirit lies salvation. The steam from the bowl rises, curling upward like incense, like a soul leaving the body, like a whisper to God. and for a moment the smell of lentils becomes holy. The market of hunger, trade, and greed. At dawn, the village square awakes like a creature stretching its limbs. The cobblestones are slick with frost. The smell of smoke, sweat, and salted meat lingers in the cold air. A bell tolls from the church tower not for prayer, but for trade. And soon they come. The peasants trudging in from the countryside with baskets of turnips and wilted greens. The merchants with bright fabrics and sharp voices. The beggars who hover like shadows at the edges, waiting for crumbs. This is not a market of plenty. It is a market of survival, a theater where hunger is bought and sold. In medieval Europe, the market square was more than a place to buy and sell. It was the heart of the town, the pulse of its stomach. Everything passed through here: gossip, spices, rumors of war, even sin. The scent of pepper from the east mingled with the stench of dung and rotting cabbage. Chickens flapped beneath the arms of housewives. Fishmongers shouted over each other, and butchers displayed their cuts with theatrical pride: boar's head, ox tongue, glistening slabs of fat that caught the pale sun like jewels. But amid all this bustle, one could see the invisible hierarchy of appetite. At one end of the square, the wealthy merchants bartered beneath striped awnings, their tables stacked with almonds, saffron, and fine wheaten loaves. At the other, peasants crouched beside threadbare cloths, selling wild onions, or the last of their grain for a few copper coins, enough, perhaps, to buy salt or a handful of flour to keep them alive another day. For the medieval poor, hunger was not an exception. It was the rhythm of existence. And in this marketplace, that hunger was both visible and invisible. Visible in the hollow faces that passed between stalls, invisible in the way everyone pretended not to see. Few sounds in the Middle Ages carried more weight than the word bread. Bread was life, and its price determined who lived and who did not. When the harvest was good, loaves appeared in the stalls like small miracles, round, warm, golden, crusted. But when the rains failed, or frost struck early, or armies trampled the fields, the miracle vanished. The price of bread rose, sometimes doubled, sometimes tripled. The rich merely grumbled. The poor starved. Chroniclers wrote of mothers standing before bakers' stalls, weeping, their coins worthless before the scales. In years of famine, bakers guarded their ovens as soldiers guarded castles. Riots erupted over a handful of grain. Some towns imposed strict bread laws, dictating exactly how large a loaf could be sold for a fixed price, yet corruption simmered beneath the parchment. Merchants diluted flour with bark or sand. The poor were too desperate to complain. Bread, that humble symbol of the sacred, became an instrument of power. Each loaf sold in the market square was not just food, it was a measure of hierarchy, an emblem of who commanded the fields and who toiled in them. To understand the late Middle Ages, one must understand the rise of the merchant. These were not noblemen, nor knights, nor priests, but they held a different kind of power, the power of trade. Grain, salt, and meat, these were their weapons. Salt was no less precious than silver. It preserved life itself, keeping meat edible through long winters and sea voyages. Grain was gold in another form. Whoever controlled its movement controlled the hunger of cities. And meat, the symbol of privilege, passed from butcher to noble house through the hands of those who profited from both ends. In port towns and crossroads markets, merchant guilds rose like small kingdoms. Their banners hung proudly above stone halls. Their ledgers became as sacred as scripture. They lent money to nobles, funded crusades, and bribed priests to bless their trade. In time, cities grew fat while villages starved. The economy of hunger built cathedrals of stone, yet beneath their wealth lay a quiet, uneasy truth. Every coin they earned had passed at least once through the hand of someone who had gone hungry. To walk through a medieval market was to see the human soul exposed, its virtues and its vices, its faith and its hunger. You could find charity here, a nun distributing bread to beggars on feast days, a butcher offering leftover scraps to the poor before closing his stall. But you could also find deceit, a merchant weighing his goods with hollow stones or watering down ale to double his profit. The church called it avaritia greed, one of the 7 deadly sins. Yet the market thrived on it. There were those who smuggled grain through city walls at night, risking death to sell at higher prices elsewhere. There were thieves who stole loaves from carts and vanished into alleyways before the guards could shout. And there were beggars, hundreds of them, who lined the market gates blind, crippled, hungry, reciting prayers for mercy as merchants stepped over them. Greed, like hunger, was an appetite that never slept. In the shadows beyond the city, another kind of trade flourished, the black market of hunger. When famine struck, grain became contraband. Peasants hoarded it, merchants hid it, guards confiscated it. But the smugglers came anyway, riding by moonlight through forests and marshes, sacks of stolen wheat tied behind their saddles. They were neither heroes nor villains, merely survivors of a cruel arithmetic. If they were caught, they faced the gallows. If they escaped, they might feed a village for a week. Some chroniclers wrote of women who carried flour beneath their skirts, or children sent to distract guards while sacks were rolled through gates at night. Hunger made ingenuity sacred. And so, while bishops prayed for rain and lords dined behind walls, the true economy of the medieval world moved silently in whispers, in shadows, and in the sound of hooves fading into the dark. Hunger did not only fill the stomach, it filled the streets. When famine returned, as it often did, the marketplace turned from theater to battlefield. Crowds surged against bakers' doors. Priests carried crosses through rioting mobs, pleading for calm. The church bells that once marked hours of trade now tolled for the dead. Yet in every famine, miracles were said to appear. A widow who shared her last loaf and found her cupboard mysteriously full the next morning. A child fed by a stranger who vanished before she could thank him. In a world ruled by hunger, even charity felt like magic. Still, the greater miracle was endurance. The poor went on living, sowing, reaping, baking, bartering, even as each year tested the limits of faith and flesh. In that endurance lay the quiet heroism of the age, the ability to live with less, to bless what little one had, and to believe that tomorrow might bring a fuller bowl. Out of hunger rose something new, the medieval city itself. As villages collapsed under famine and plague, people fled to towns seeking food, work, and safety. The market swelled. Trade grew complex. Guilds and laws multiplied. The city became both a promise and a trap, a place where abundance and poverty could share the same street. Behind the walls, bakers' guilds fought for privilege. Millers took their share of every sack. The price of food was now debated not in the field, but in the council hall. Hunger became a matter of policy, a tool to control labor, rebellion, even faith. And so, the very same hunger that once emptied bellies now filled treasuries. The marketplace, born from need, had become an empire of appetite. If you stood at the center of a great medieval market, say Bruges, or Florence, or London, and turned slowly, you could see two worlds at once. On one side, barrels of imported spices gleamed in the sun, symbols of distant wealth, cinnamon from Ceylon, cloves from Zanzibar, pepper worth more than gold. On the other, barefoot peasants begged for crusts or sold their labor for a bowl of thin pottage. The smell of roasting meat drifted past those who had never tasted it. A golden pie could cost what a laborer earned in a month. Yet everyone shared the same air, the same cobblestones, the same hunger. This was the paradox of medieval life. In the shadow of abundance, starvation thrived. To look at the medieval market is to look into a mirror that reflects our own world. Greed and generosity, hunger and hope, all intertwined. The marketplace was humanity condensed, chaotic, cruel, yet somehow capable of grace. For every merchant counting coins, there was a beggar counting blessings. For every act of deceit, an act of mercy followed quietly behind. And through it all, the same fragile wish endured to eat, to live, to endure another winter. In the market of hunger, even the smallest act, the giving of a crust, the sharing of salt became a form of faith. As the sun sets, the marketplace begins to empty. The stalls are dismantled, the cries of merchants fade. A few dogs nose through scraps. A beggar wraps himself in a torn cloak beside the church steps. Smoke drifts upward from the last brazier, curling into the violet sky. In one corner, a baker closes his shutters. Inside, on the wooden counter, lies a single unsold loaf, still warm, its crust cracked like dry earth. He hesitates, then steps outside, places it silently beside the sleeping beggar, and walks away. The bell tolls again, this time for vespers. The sound floats over rooftops, over the market square, over the fields, beyond the walls. And for a moment, the smell of bread and smoke returns faint, fleeting a reminder that in the Middle Ages, hunger was both a curse and a communion. In the marketplace of the medieval world, the measure of a man was not what he owned, but what he was willing to share. The Feast of Lords. Power served on silver. Night falls over the castle. Beyond its walls, the wind howls across frozen fields where no one eats tonight. But inside, within the stone heart of the fortress, warmth reigns. The great hall glows with torchlight, banners ripple in the draft, and the scent of roasted meat fills the air so thickly that even the stones seem to breathe it in. This is not a meal. It is a spectacle, a sermon in flesh and wine. The Feast of the Lords, where food itself becomes the language of power. Step into the great hall and let your eyes adjust to its splendor. A long table stretches beneath beams of blackened oak, so vast that its far end disappears into haze. Tapestries shimmer along the walls, stitched with hunts and saints, while 1,000 candles drip wax onto silver. At the high table raised upon a dais sits the lord and lady, their clothes jeweled with threads of gold. The goblets before them gleam like miniature suns. Each seat below descends by rank: knights, squires, pages, and servants. A hierarchy carved not only into stone but into appetite. The feast begins with sound, trumpets blaring from the gallery, heralds crying out titles, the scrape of benches as guests rise. A prayer murmured more for form than faith, and then, like a tide breaking, the first platters arrive. Steam rises, laughter bursts, the theater of hunger begins. In the Middle Ages, to host a feast was to declare one's might not with swords but with courses. Servants, dressed in the colors of their master's arms, march in formation, bearing dishes that seem almost unreal. A roasted boar's head, its tusks gilded and apple clenched between its teeth. A pie whose crust is brushed with gold leaf, inside which songbirds flutter out when cut. A swan redressed in its own feathers, neck arched in eternal grace. And peacocks, the most glorious of all, served whole, their tails fanned, their beaks tipped in silver, their bodies perfumed with cinnamon and clove. These were not meals meant to be eaten, they were meant to be seen. Food here was a proclamation: I command the world's abundance. I rule over hunger itself. And beneath that declaration lay a more sacred echo. In the eyes of the medieval noble, feasting was not merely indulgence. It was divine right proof that God had chosen him to enjoy what others could only dream of. At the high table, every gesture is a sentence, every bite a sign. To eat like a lord was to perform one's place in the order of creation. There were rules endless, intricate, absolute. A man must not tear his bread with both hands. A lady must not lick her fingers, even when the honey ran thick upon them. One must not drink until the host has raised his goblet. One must never reach across another's plate. The placement of knives, the folding of cloths, the timing of toasts, all became a silent choreography of hierarchy. And in this ritual of manners, the world found its order reaffirmed. The noble ruled, the priest blessed, the servant served, and all was as heaven intended. Even at the table, society was eaten in courses. While meat and wine filled the hall, sound filled the space between. From the gallery above came the lutes and rebecks, their notes weaving through the smoke like ribbons of light. Minstrels sang of crusades and courtly love. Jesters danced, their bells clinking as they bowed before laughter. At times, the Lord himself would call for silence, not out of solemnity, but to hear a story. A troubadour would step forward, his voice low and trembling, telling of heroes long dead, of dragons slain, of God's mercy and man's pride. The hall would fall still, even the torches seemed to lean in to listen until applause shattered the spell and wine flowed again. But amid the laughter and music there was something unspoken, something that lay heavy beneath the gold, the silence of those who served. For every platter carried to the dais, a pair of hands trembled beneath its weight. For every toast raised, a dozen unseen eyes watched from the shadows, waiting for leftovers, waiting for permission to eat. Behind the hall, beyond a narrow archway, the air changes. Here lies the true heart of the feast, the kitchen, a cathedral of chaos. Fires roar in vast stone hearths, spitting grease onto the faces of boys who turn the spits. The smell is overwhelming. Blood, fat, smoke, and sweet spice. Cooks shout above the din, their words lost in the crackle of flames. Servants scurry through corridors with buckets of wine and trays of bread. Dogs slink underfoot, hoping for scraps. And somewhere in the corner, the cook, the unseen architect of grandeur, stirs a pot of broth for the servants. He does not eat from the silver platters he creates. He eats what burns, what falls, what is left. In the medieval kitchen, as in the world beyond, glory was consumed by those above, and hunger by those below. Every dish on the Lord's table carried a message. Roasted venison spoke of dominion over the hunt, a symbol of land and mastery. Exotic spices whispered of distant conquest, pepper from India, nutmeg from the islands, sugar from far-off trade routes, wine from Burgundy, olives from Spain, figs from the Holy Land, each by the geography of control. The Lord who served these things did not merely offer hospitality, he displayed empire. To feed others was to remind them that they could not feed themselves without his grace. And so, food became the architecture of power, as carefully constructed as the castle itself. The medieval mind saw feasting not only as privilege, but as theology. In a world ruled by faith, abundance was evidence of divine favor. God gives plenty to those who please him, wrote one chronicler, and to those he disfavors, only stones. Banquets, therefore, were shadowed by sanctity. A priest might bless the table before the first course, sprinkling holy water upon silver and wine. Bread might be crossed before being broken. Even gluttony, the sin of excess, could be excused if one's feast honored God or the king. In this theology of appetite, to eat was to confirm one's place in the cosmic order, to taste heaven's hierarchy on earth. And yet, beneath the golden light, there lingered a quiet irony. The more the lords feasted in God's name, the further they drifted from the hunger that was said to sanctify the soul. While laughter echoed through the hall, the sound traveled downward through the cracks in the stone, through the servant passages, into the dark where the poor waited. Outside in the courtyard, beggars huddled by the gate, drawn by the smell of roasting meat. They knew that when the feast ended, scraps might be thrown from the back door. A crust of bread, a gnawed bone, a ladle of wine turned sour. Children sometimes crept close enough to see through the shutters, the shimmer of candlelight, the gleam of goblets before being chased away. The same light that gilded the Lord's face was reflected in their hungry eyes. If the feast above was a vision of heaven, the hunger below was its shadow, and the distance between the two, between laughter and silence, was the true measure of medieval power. Every feast ends the same way, not in riot, but in silence. The last course has been cleared, perhaps candied fruits or marchpanes shaped like castles and crowns. The musicians have fallen quiet. The Lord leans back, his fingers glistening with fat, his heart heavy with wine. The hall grows still except for the whisper of flames. It is in this moment that the illusion trembles. For just a heartbeat, the Lord feels the weight of it all, the cost of abundance, the eyes that watched him eat, the prayers whispered beyond the walls. But the moment passes. A jest is made, the laughter returns, and the ritual resumes. Power, like hunger, does not linger in reflection. To dine at the table of a medieval lord was to witness a vision of the world as it wished to be seen, ordered, blessed, eternal. The feast was theater, and every guest an actor, each mouthful another line in a play about wealth, faith, and distance. Silver was not chosen for beauty alone. It was believed to purify food, to guard against poison, a fitting symbol for those who lived surrounded by envy. Gold glittered not as decoration, but as declaration. I am untouchable, chosen, sacred in my appetite. Yet the truth was simpler and sadder. Every goblet of wine poured in the great hall had been pressed from the labor of fields that never saw its light. Every roasted bird once pecked grain grown by hands that would never taste meat. The Feast of Lords was built upon invisible hunger, a balance as delicate as the silver it shone upon. Outside, the wind howls again. The torches burn low. The beggars have drifted away into the dark. Inside, the last of the nobles retire to their chambers, full and drowsy, leaving the hall scattered with bones, fruit peels, and half-empty goblets. Servants move silently among the debris, clearing what remains, collecting scraps for tomorrow's meal. And somewhere in the distance, perhaps in a village not far from the castle walls, a mother divides a loaf of coarse bread among her children. The same moonlight falls upon both tables. One reflects silver, the other ash. In the Feast of Lords, power was not spoken. It was eaten, one gilded bite at a time. The castle kitchen, behind the splendor. The feast glitters above silver, laughter, wine. But behind the door carved with lions and vines, another world breathes, the hidden kingdom of heat and smoke. Here, beneath arches blackened by centuries of flame, the air trembles with noise, the hiss of dripping fat, the rhythmic chop of cleavers, the constant roar of fire. It is a world without silk or ceremony, without gold or grace. And yet, without this world, the feast above would starve. This is the castle kitchen, where splendor is forged in sweat. Every castle had one, a single, narrow door between the great hall and the kitchen, between performance and production, between luxury and labor. Through that doorway passed everything that made a lord appear divine. The roasted meats, the spiced wine, the golden pies. But never did the guests beyond those doors see what it cost to make them. On the feast nights, the kitchen began before dawn. Torches flared, fires were stoked, and servants stumbled half awake to their stations. In the cold, before the ovens grew hot, the air smelled of wood smoke and raw meat, of onion skins and wet stone. By mid-morning, the temperature would rise until even the walls seemed to sweat. No silence lived here. only movement, orders, and breath. It was an empire of motion, and every motion served one purpose: to feed the illusion above. If the great hall was ruled by nobles, the kitchen was ruled by hands, dozens of them, working as one unseen. There was the spit turner, usually a boy no older than 12, whose job was to turn the heavy iron rods that held entire animals, pigs, peacocks, sometimes even oxen over the fire. His arms blistered from the heat, his eyes watered with smoke. He turned for hours without pause, until muscle and flame became rhythm. There were the scullions. The lowest of the low, their world was the floor, their task eternal. Scrub, wash, scrape, fetch. They cleaned what others dirtied and ate what others refused. The pastry cook worked in a haze of flour, his fingers deft and quick, folding dough that would later encase fruits, meats, or nothing at all. For a pie was as much architecture as it was food. And then there was the butler, lord of the buttery, keeper of wines and cellars, whose key ring was a crown of its own. His word could raise or ruin reputations, for he poured the drink that drowned both joy and fear. Each of them knew their place. Each of them dreamed of moving one rung higher. But in the kitchen's hierarchy, as in the world outside, few ever climbed far. Among all the kitchen's workers, one bore a strange and silent duty: the taster. He was often young, quick, and forgettable. His task? To sample every dish before it reached the Lord's table, to ensure it held no poison. It was a job wrapped in fear and fatalism. One bite could mean death, and yet it was also an honor, a step closer to the warmth of power, to the silver that gleamed just beyond the doorway. Some tasters prayed before each meal. Others trusted only the cook's hands. Chroniclers tell of those who died quietly in the scullery, their deaths erased from the records of the feast. The guests above would eat and laugh, never knowing how close their joy had come to silence. In the castle, even hunger could kill, and so could trust. At the center of this storm stood one man, the master cook, commander of the kitchen, orchestrator of chaos. He was no simple laborer. He was part artist, part alchemist, part general. His name might never be sung in halls or carved in stone, but he understood the power of taste better than most bishops understood scripture. He knew how long to roast a boar until its flesh turned tender beneath the knife. He knew which herbs masked the scent of age, which spices could turn cheap meat into a noble's delight. He kept mental ledgers of ingredients: pepper from Venice, honey from Provence, salt from mines beneath the Rhine. His tools were knives, fire, and instinct. His battlefield was time itself. Every mistake could ruin a course, and every course a reputation. The first cook lived in the shadow of splendor, yet his work created it. He could not dine at the high table, but he fed those who did, and in doing so, shaped how power tasted. To hear a kitchen at its height was to hear the voice of command turned into chaos. Orders flew like sparks. More wood. Turn the spit. Mind the sauce. Now, the pastry not yet. Wait for the trumpets. Because timing was everything. A noble feast was not random. It was choreographed. Each dish had to arrive in order, at temperature, in harmony with music and ceremony above. Messengers ran between hall and kitchen, panting, carrying signals from the steward. The Lord has finished the venison, or the lady calls for the fish. Each phrase meant a new fire to stoke, a new course to summon from the frenzy. And so the kitchen worked not in hours, but in moments measured by heartbeat, by instinct, by the turning of the spit. The cook's cry could silence a dozen men, and his silence could terrify them more. The heart of the castle kitchen was its hearth, vast, roaring, ancient, a mouth of stone that devoured wood by the ton and exhaled life into the feast above. Here, fire was both tool and tyrant. It blistered hands, seared lungs, and lit the room with a cruel beauty. Around it, the cooks worked like priests at an altar, turning, basting, whispering curses and prayers in equal measure. The smell was overwhelming. Blood, garlic, smoke, sweet fat, the perfume of survival. Pots of stew simmered beside pans of sauce, bread baked in great clay ovens, and dripping channels ran with grease. The floor was slick, the air alive with sparks. And through it all came the sound, the music of labor, the thud of cleavers, the clang of lids, the hiss of wine poured over flame. If the great hall was a cathedral of beauty, the kitchen was its forge. Ironically, many of those who cooked the feast rarely ate their fill. A servant might spend all day preparing meat, yet taste none of it. A scullion might gnaw a bone discarded by a knight and call it fortune. The cook himself, exhausted and slick with sweat, often dined only when the hall had emptied his meal, the scraps of the spectacle he created. And yet, there was pride here, pride not in wealth, but in craft. For every flawless dish, every unburned loaf, every sauce that reached the high table unspilled was a quiet victory. In a world divided by class, skill was the only bridge that crossed the chasm briefly, invisibly. The kitchen, in its chaos, contained both oppression and opportunity. It was the only place in the castle where a peasant's hand could shape the meal of a king. By midday, the kitchen became a battlefield. Cooks shouted above the roar, pots clanged, and sweat dripped like rain. Yet, amid the chaos, there was order, a pattern only the first cook could see. He moved through the haze like a general in war, eyes sharp, words few, every step precise. He knew which boy would faint first from heat, which servant would spill wine, which dish must reach the Lord untouched. He remembered not only recipes but politics, who sat near whom at the high table, which alliances demanded which delicacies. A dish was never only a dish, it was diplomacy. A pheasant roasted whole might honor a visiting baron. A simple pottage might insult him. The cook served not just appetite but ambition. His ladle stirred more than broth, it stirred power itself. As the sun climbed, the kitchen pulsed like a living heart. Morning brought preparation, knives flashing, herbs chopped, barrels opened. Midday was command orders shouted, dishes plated, disasters narrowly avoided. Evening brought silence, not peace, but aftermath. After the last platter had left, the fires were banked low. Servants collapsed on benches, their hands raw, their faces streaked with soot. The smell of char and spice hung in the air like memory. Someone laughed a short, tired sound. Someone else wept quietly. Outside, the great hall rang with applause for the feast, and the cook allowed himself a small smile. No one would call his name, but he knew the success above was born from his storm below. In the faint orange glow, he carved a crust of bread, dipped it into the cooling sauce, and ate in silence. For a moment, the taste was pure, not of class or power, but of work well done. What made the castle kitchen remarkable was not its grandeur, but its transformation. It turned the raw into the regal, the humble into the holy. A turnip from a muddy field became a delicacy when simmered in wine. A pigeon became a poem when wrapped in pastry and gilded. Every cut, every spice was a translation from survival to splendor. This was the unseen art of the medieval world, the alchemy of appetite. And those who practiced it, cooks, servants, boys, and girls, were its silent magicians. They conjured nobility from hunger, and though they ate last, they fed everyone. When dawn came again, and the fires were lit anew, the cycle would begin once more. For every feast that glittered in the hall, there were hands behind it, blistered, blackened, and beautiful. Behind every golden goblet lies a hand that burned to polish it. Behind every feast a fire that never slept. The spice road, scent of power. Before the hum of ships and coins, before the names of kings and saints were carved into stone, There was a smell sharp, golden, and alive. It came from far beyond the horizon. It clung to the fingers of sailors and the ledgers of merchants. It whispered of lands no map could hold. This was the scent of power. This was spice. In the Middle Ages, a single grain of pepper could cross half the known world. It might begin beneath the humid canopy of India's Malabar coast, harvested by calloused hands that never saw the lands their labor fed. From there, it would travel to the ports of Calicut, where Arab traders packed it into sacks and sealed them with wax. Weeks later, it would reach Alexandria, the crossroads of scent and empire, and from there, Phoenician galleys would bear it northward across the glittering Mediterranean. By the time it reached the tables of Paris or London, its price had multiplied 100-fold. Each grain was a bead of history. Each breath of cinnamon or saffron was a story of oceans and greed. And yet, for all its distance, spice was the heartbeat of Europe's hunger. In a world without refrigeration, spices were more than luxury. They were magic. They preserved meat, masked decay, and gave dull bread the illusion of life. But beyond their function, they held symbolism. Pepper was fire captured in seed, strength, heat, and dominance. Cinnamon was sweetness and sanctity, a flavor that perfumed both prayer and pastry. Saffron, bright as the sun, dearer than gold, colored the food of kings like a painter's brushstroke upon a canvas of hunger. To eat spice was to eat the world. To afford it was to command it. The medieval palate was less about subtlety than spectacle. Where the poor man's table tasted of earth and ash, the Lord's tongue sought heaven itself in the form of powdered clove, nutmeg, ginger, and cardamom. The dish was not complete until it smelled of somewhere else. The great merchant families of Venice and Genoa understood this better than any monarch. They did not rule by sword or crown, but by scent. Their galleys moved like shadows across the sea, laden with goods whose value could not be measured by weight, only by longing. They dealt in dreams of flavor, and every port they touched bloomed briefly into paradise. They kept ledgers written in both ink and secrecy, routes guarded, prices manipulated, rumors spread like smoke. The pepper harvest failed, the Sultan has closed the road, a new island lies beyond the edge of the sea. Behind these rumors were wars. Behind every shipment, treaties. Behind every spice jar, a story of blood. The merchants of Venice grew richer than kings. They built palaces from pepper. And when popes or emperors sought power, they did not pray, they bargained with traders. For in the Middle Ages, whoever controlled the scent controlled the appetite. At first, spices were miracles brought by faith. The church spoke of cinnamon as a gift from Eden and pepper as a spark of divine fire that fell upon the earth at creation. But as the centuries turned, taste became politics. What one ate became what one was. To own a spice chest carved of oak, inlaid with brass, locked with iron, was to possess the keys to paradise. Within, each compartment held a fortune. Nutmeg like dark pearls, cloves sharp as stars, saffron threads coiled like captured sunlight. A nobleman might display his spice chest as one would a relic, opening it before guests to release a breath of wealth. To sprinkle saffron on a dish was not cooking, it was proclamation. To serve peppered meat was to declare one's reach across the world. Meanwhile, in the villages, peasants stirred their thin pottage and watched as rumors of distant lands drifted by like smoke. The scent of spice was hope and proof of distance. Travelers and chroniclers filled the silence between continents with legends. They spoke of the cinnamon bird, said to gather sticks of cinnamon to build its nest high on cliffs so perilous that merchants could only harvest them by throwing stones until the nest broke. They told of the valley of pepper, where serpents guarded the plants, and only when flames drove them off could one gather the precious grains. They whispered of saffron's tears, believed to be the dried blood of phoenixes, fallen into the soil of Persia. These myths were more than fantasy. They were a kind of faith, a way to make sense of how something so small could carry so much power. For when the truth was too distant, the imagination filled the map. By the 13th century, Europe had become addicted to scent. From kitchens to chapels, from apothecaries to royal courts, spices were everywhere and nowhere near enough. They flavor not only food but faith. Incense curled in the churches, blending myrrh with prayer. Perfumes anointed kings and corpses alike. Doctors prescribed pepper for cough, cinnamon for melancholy, and nutmeg for plague. It was believed that good smells purified the air, that they drove away disease and sin. To inhale spice was to inhale safety. The nobles dined not to fill their bellies, but to perfume their souls. Their halls became theaters of aroma, where every dish was both medicine and performance. And beneath it all the quiet truth, spice was control. Control of trade, of body, of desire. When famine struck, gold could not be eaten, but spice could buy survival. During the Crusades, armies marched not only for faith, but for flavor. Chroniclers tell of knights who looted spice chests as they would holy relics. A handful of pepper could ransom a prisoner. A pound of saffron could fund a voyage. Even the language of economy bent around flavor. To season meant not only to flavor food, but to make something fit for trade. To spice was to make desirable. The very concept of luxury was born in these jars. And so, across seas and deserts, through storms and wars, the scent of power drifted, invisible, irresistible. But behind the shimmer of saffron and the perfume of cinnamon lay darker stories. In the ports of the East, laborers broke their backs to fill sacks that would never feed them. In the holds of ships, men died so that Europe could taste sweetness in winter. In markets, children carried baskets heavier than hope. The spice road was not a single path, but a web woven with sweat, blood, and salt water. Merchants grew rich while sailors vanished, explorers chased illusions, and empires drew borders not by faith, but by flavor. Every feast in a candlelit hall was built upon someone else's hunger. Every golden crust glimmered with distance and debt, and still the scent was worth the cost. In royal treasuries, beside jewels and crowns, stood the spice chest guarded as jealously as gold. Its contents were weighed like coin, inventoried with reverence. When kings traveled, the chest traveled with them. Henry III of England once demanded that his royal cook never serve a dish without a trace of spice, lest the taste of commonness offend the tongue of God's anointed. In France, Charles V kept a private chamber where spices were stored beneath lock and seal, and only his physician held the second key. For rulers, spice was not food, it was proof of dominion, of reach, of divine favor. To hold saffron was to hold the sun itself. To taste cinnamon was to taste empire. And yet, in the same kingdom, peasants still boiled roots and prayed for rain. In the end, spice did more than flavor bread. It reshaped the map. The hunger for pepper sent ships westward, chasing a shortcut to India. Cinnamon built colonies. Nutmeg sparked wars. The search for taste became the story of exploration itself, a pilgrimage of appetite disguised as destiny. By the dawn of the modern age, when new continents had been claimed and old ones bled dry, the scent of spice still lingered faint but eternal. It haunted kitchens and cathedrals alike, a reminder that power has always been something we consume. The medieval man prayed to God, but he traded for flavor. And in every grain of pepper, there was a prophecy that someday taste would rule the world. Spice was never just food. It was faith, wealth, and wonder. The dream that the tongue could touch eternity. Women of the hearth, keepers of flame. Before kingdoms were built, before kings or priests or parchment, there was a woman tending a fire. Her hands were rough, her face lined by smoke and seasons. Around her, children slept, and the night pressed in cold and endless. She stirred the pot slowly, tasting the world through hunger, patience, and hope. Every civilization begins there at the fire a woman lit. In the Middle Ages, history was written by men, monks, warriors, kings, but life was sustained by women. While chroniclers filled their pages with battles and coronations, another story simmered quietly beneath one written not in ink, but in heat and care. In cottages and castles alike, the hearth was more than stone and smoke. It was the axis of existence, the point where labor met love, where faith took form not in words, but in bread. Women guarded that space. They fed the hungry, mended the wounded, softened the day's cruelty with a bowl of soup or a cup of ale. Their names were rarely recorded, but their touch flavored every life that passed through the Middle Ages. Her mornings began before dawn. A cough from the chimney, the creak of a door, the pale light slipping through frost. The peasant wife was the spine of survival. She gathered wood, kindled flame, mixed flour with water, and prayed that the bread would rise. Sometimes it didn't. Sometimes the grain was moldy, or the child fevered, or the husband away in the Lord's field. Yet still, she stirred. Her kitchen was not a room, it was a boundary between life and hunger. The iron pot that hung over her fire held more than food. It held rhythm. Each turn of the spoon was an act of endurance. She might feed 6 children from one loaf, pouring the broth thinner each night, whispering to them that tomorrow it will be thicker. She lied with love, and when the bread cooled, she marked it with a cross because faith, too, must eat. In the castle above, another woman ruled a different flame. The noble lady, wrapped in velvet and lace, did not need her own dough. Her hands were white, her kitchen distant, yet she too was bound to the hearth, not by labor, but by duty. The management of food was one of her sacred roles. She oversaw the servants, approved the menus, ensured that hospitality reflected her family's grace. To feed guests generously was to declare virtue. To serve the poor at the gate was to buy favor in heaven. At feast days, she might taste the first dish, a gesture of dignity, a benediction over abundance. Her kitchen was vast, but her purpose was the same as the peasant wife's, to sustain. Beneath the silks and the solemnity, she too was keeper of the flame, the unseen architect of comfort in a world that seldom allowed women to build. Far from field or fortress, another kind of woman tended her own kind of hunger. In the stone convents that dotted the hills and valleys of Europe, nuns lived by the rhythm of bells and seasons. Their kitchens were humble, narrow hearths, pots of lentils, loaves of coarse bread. Meals were eaten in silence, each bite accompanied by scripture. And yet, even here, food was more than sustenance. To feed one another was to serve God. To prepare the Eucharist bread, to pour the wine, to share the fast, these were acts of devotion as profound as any prayer. In the infirmary, the sisters became healers. They made broths for the weak, mixed honey with herbs, and baked soft cakes for those too frail to chew. Through food, they practiced the theology of care, mercy, rendered edible. The nuns' fire burned quietly, unseen from the road, but its warmth reached far into villages, into hearts, into history. Food was the first language most women spoke fluently, and the last one they ever forgot. Long before literacy, a woman's way of saying I love you was through the spoon, the loaf, the flame, a bowl of warm milk for a fevered child, a crust of bread saved for a husband late from the fields, a shared onion, a whispered grace. Even in courts and convents, that language endured. Love in the Middle Ages was rarely written in letters. Parchment was for the privileged. But it was cooked, daily, quietly, endlessly. To stir a pot was to promise tomorrow. To light a fire was to refuse despair. Each meal was a testimony that life, despite everything, could still be kind. Among all women of the hearth, few were more revered than the midwife. She carried both herbs and hope. Her hands delivered not only life but nourishment. After birth, she would feed the mother broth thickened with barley, wine warmed with honey. She knew which roots eased pain, which teas calmed trembling, which foods coaxed milk to flow. Her knowledge was ancient, inherited, whispered from mouth to mouth across generations. It was not written in books, it lived in practice. She might also feed the dying the same spoon that greeted life would ease its passing. In that, she embodied the entire cycle of human hunger. To feed, to heal, to farewell. Where the priest anointed with oil, the midwife anointed with soup, and both believed they touched the divine. Though women's names rarely appeared in chronicles, their recipes did. Manuscripts from abbeys and manors record dishes labeled as my lady taught or as the old sister prepared. Through these fragments, we glimpse a lineage of memory, a chain of female knowledge that wove culture through kitchens. It was women who remembered which herbs soothed fever, which grains lasted longest, which spices sweetened grief. It was women who taught the next generation to measure salt not by scale, but by intuition. Every recipe was a story disguised as instruction. Take the roots gathered after rain. Boil till the color of sunset. Stir until your arm aches, then pray. These words survive like fossils of affection. Through them, we can still taste their patience. To tend a hearth in the Middle Ages was also an act of faith. Fire itself was sacred, both creation and danger. It warmed, it fed, it punished, it forgave. Women prayed beside it as men prayed in cathedrals. Each spark was a resurrection, each loaf a small miracle. In many villages, the hearth flame was never allowed to die. It was kept alive from season to season, carried in embers during moves, reignited each dawn. To let it go out was to invite misfortune. Even saints were linked to kitchens. Saint Martha, patron of cooks, Saint Bridget, whose perpetual fire burned in Kildare for centuries, Saint Zita, who fed the poor with bread that miraculously never ran out. Through their stories, the mundane became holy. Cooking was not mere labor, it was liturgy. Yet for all their strength, women's labor was rarely praised. The peasant wife's exhaustion, the nun's silence, the lady's obedience, all were expected, invisible. History celebrated the sword, not the spoon. But without the spoon, no sword could rise. It was women who endured famine, who stretched harvest through barren winters, who mended hope from hunger. They carried empires not on their backs but in their bowls. And sometimes, in the stillness of night, when the fire burned low, they must have wondered if anyone would remember them. They needn't have worried. Every warm meal since carries their shadow. Centuries later, when castles crumbled and kingdoms changed, the hearth endured. It traveled into cottages and taverns, into cities and kitchens of stone and steel. But its essence, that small, steady light, remained unchanged. Because the hearth is not a place, it is an inheritance, a whisper passed down through hands that fed and healed and forgave. In the flicker of every flame, we can still see them, the women who stirred, who prayed, who stayed. They were not queens, yet they ruled time. They were not saints, yet they sanctified the everyday. Their fire burned still in the smell of bread, in the warmth of soup, in the comfort that says, "You are home." Every civilization begins at the fire a woman lit. And every time we eat, we honor the hands that kept it burning. Hunger and sin, the dark banquet. The bells no longer rang. Their ropes had rotted in the damp silence of famine, and the towers stood like empty throats against a gray sky. In the valleys, the fields were bare, not harvested, not plowed, but abandoned, as if the earth itself had forgotten how to give. Winter had come early that year, and with it, a hunger so deep it swallowed songs, prayers, and even the sound of laughter. Chroniclers would later write, "The living envied the dead." Oh, at first, the hunger was just a nuisance, an empty belly before dawn, a thin broth that smelled of water and smoke. But soon it became a constant presence, a dull ache beneath the ribs, a ghost that followed people into sleep. Bread, once the daily prayer of the poor, became myth. The millstone stood still because there was no grain to grind. The ovens were cold, the air heavy with the sourness of mildew. Mothers mixed bark and clay into what they called famine bread. It filled the mouth, but not the body. One chronicler from 1317 wrote of people eating cats, dogs, and roots of trees. In one village, a woman was seen boiling her shoes, scraping the leather with tears on her cheeks. In another, a priest buried his own brother after finding him frozen in the field, his hands clutching a handful of straw as if it were food. Hunger stripped away the layers of civility. It made people animals and then ghosts. The Great Famine of 1315, 1317 swept through Europe like an invisible plague of emptiness. Rain ruined the harvests. Grain rotted in granaries. Cattle died in the mud. The rivers overflowed, washing away bridges and hope. People said God had turned his face away. At market squares, crowds gathered not to buy, but to beg. The price of bread rose like smoke. Merchants locked their stores behind iron bolts, and soldiers guarded shipments of grain meant for nobles and clergy. One scribe in Bruges recorded, "Men robbed the baker's cart and were hanged with the loaves still in their hands." To eat became a moral question. Who deserved to live? Who deserved to starve? Charity, once preached by the church, became dangerous, for a loaf of bread could cost a life. There are stories whispered in the margins of chronicles of what happened when hunger reached its darkest hour. Stories that monks hesitated to write and priests refused to read aloud. In 1316, in a small town near Cambrai, they said a woman killed her child and tried to eat. In another chronicle, during a siege, men were seen roasting the bodies of the dead. Whether these tales were true or born of hysteria, no one could say. But hunger itself was a kind of sin, not of gluttony, but of despair. It made men lose their faith in both God and man. The church called it the dark banquet. And in that banquet, there was no host, no table, no music, only the sound of chewing and the silence that followed. Even the wolves grew bold, wandering into villages at night. The living envied the beasts, for at least they had something to eat. In the shadow of hunger, food became power. Kings starved their enemies, not with swords, but with sieges. A city surrounded could fall faster to an empty stomach than to fire. During the 100 Years' War, armies burned fields and granaries, salted wells, and slaughtered cattle not for meat, but to deny it to others. Famine became a strategy, as cruel as any weapon. Villages were left as blackened shells, the soil poisoned by ash, and when peace came, the people found that hunger had taken root deeper than any seed. A French soldier once wrote in a letter home, "I have seen towns die not by battle, but by the silence of their kitchens." The church preached that hunger was a test, that those who suffered would be rewarded in heaven, while the greedy would be punished in hell. But in the same century, bishops dined on fish and venison during Lent, their tables lined with silver. Behind monastery walls, the fast became feasts disguised under words like pious moderation. The contradiction stank worse than the famine itself. Pilgrims and paupers waited outside abbey gates, begging for the crumbs of Christ's charity. Sometimes they were fed, sometimes they were turned away, and sometimes the dogs of the monks were fed before them. In such moments, faith curdled into bitterness. If food was sacred, why did God bless only the rich with it? If hunger was holy, why did the holy never starve? What does it mean to eat? It is a question older than religion and as profound as death. In times of abundance, eating is pleasure, the art of taste, the joy of company. But in times of famine, it becomes a ritual of survival, a moral battlefield. Is a thief who steals bread from a Lord's table guilty? Is a mother who feeds her child by stealing from the church damned? The medieval mind wrestled with these questions as fiercely as it did with sin and salvation. Some theologians argued that hunger stripped away free will, that starvation excused all crimes. Others said it revealed the truth of the soul. In hunger, man meets himself naked, without pride or pretense. And what they saw terrified them. When hunger lasts too long, it eats not just the body, but the mind. Neighbors turn against each other. Bakers were accused of hiding grain. Farmers lied about their stores. The word trust disappeared from the tongue. In one English chronicle, it was said, even the priests sold the host for bread. Albu. Marriage markets collapsed, no dowries, no hope. Children were abandoned at church doors. Some monasteries became cemeteries. When famine met plague, as it did in the mid-14th century, entire villages vanished. The smoke that once rose from kitchen fires was replaced by the smoke of burning corpses. And when no one cooked anymore, silence fell. The silence of empty hearths, of extinguished lives. Yet not all was despair. In the ashes of hunger, a strange kind of faith survived. In convents, nuns shared what little they had. Peasant women baked bread from ground beans and chestnuts, sharing it with neighbors weaker than themselves. Priests buried the dead by moonlight, whispering prayers over the unmarked earth. A chronicler from York wrote, when there was nothing to eat, they sang instead. And perhaps that too was a kind of nourishment, the defiance of spirit, the will to remain human even when humanity was starving. History remembers kings and wars, but hunger is the true chronicler of the human heart. It reveals who we are when the table is empty. In the medieval world, food was not only a meal, it was meaning itself. To feast was to show power. To fast was to show faith. To starve was to be forgotten. And yet, hunger united everyone, lord and beggar alike, in the simple truth that all bodies crave the same bread. Even kings, for all their silver platters, feared the famine that crept beneath their walls. Even the monks who prayed for moderation whispered extra words for their supper. In the end, hunger was democracy in its cruelest form. There is a story found in a 14th century chronicle about a village in Lorraine. It tells that after a long famine, a traveler passed through and found it deserted. The houses were intact. The tools lay where they had been dropped. On one table, he saw a loaf of bread black with mold, half eaten. The fire beneath the pot had long gone cold. He wrote, there was no smell of life, nor of death, only the silence where supper should have been. Perhaps that silence is the truest image of the dark banquet. Not the horror of cannibalism or the cruelty of kings, but the stillness that follows when the last ember fades. When the kitchen, the heart of the world, no longer beats, to speak of hunger is to speak of power, of who eats and who watches. It is to confront the ancient fear that civilization is only one failed harvest away from chaos. Even today, when markets overflow and spices cross oceans in hours, the memory of famine lingers in our bones. It is why we bless food before eating, why we store grain just in case, why bread, that humble miracle of grain and fire, still feels sacred. The Middle Ages taught humanity this truth. Food is never just sustenance. It is the story of mercy, greed, faith, and sin told one meal at a time. And in that story, hunger remains the oldest character. It has no face, no name, no kingdom, but it has always been here waiting at the edge of the table, watching the feast. The king's feast. The illusion of fullness. It is evening. The castle stands like a jewel upon the hill, a citadel of light, surrounded by the sleeping dark. From its open windows, music floats out into the night, carried on the scent of wine, wax, and roasted meat. The stars above are pale compared to the torches blazing in the courtyard. Inside, the great hall shimmers. Tapestries of crimson and gold hide the damp stone. Tables stretch from one end to the other, draped in linen white as snow. Silver dishes gleam beneath the glow of hundreds of candles. This is not merely a dinner. It is a vision of power, a theater where appetite becomes art and food becomes the language of kings. A herald's trumpet sounds. The doors swing open and servants glide in a slow procession, carrying trays that smoke and shine. Peacocks, their feathers restored after roasting, shimmer in blue and green. Pies shaped like castles reveal live doves that flutter into the air. Swans appear with crowns of gold leaf upon their heads. The nobles gasp, half in awe, half in hunger. At the head of the table sits the king, robed in velvet, his fingers glittering with rings. He does not eat yet. He watches. For this moment, every eye is upon him, and his silence is as heavy as the crown upon his brow. Then, with a gesture, he breaks the bread. The hall erupts in motion, goblets lifted, laughter swelling, knives flashing in the candlelight. The music rises, the air thick with spice and sweat. It is as if the famine and filth of the peasant world never existed. And yet, in the hidden corners, the servants watch with hollow eyes. They have cooked for hours, but they will not taste what they serve. Every feast is performance, and none more elaborate than that of the late medieval court. To eat in such splendor was to proclaim divine favor. Each dish was a message. Roasted boar for bravery, gilded pies for wealth, fish for piety. To chew was to assert dominion. To swallow was to rule. The dining hall became a stage, and the courtiers its actors bowing, praising, pretending surprise. The king smiled when expected, nodded when pleased, and never forgot that a careless glance could become rumor. Behind the laughter there was always fear, for in the age of daggers and ambition, the table was both sanctuary and battlefield. A poisoned cup could end a dynasty. A single dish, seasoned wrongly, could whisper treason. The royal taster, pale and silent, tasted every bite before the king did. He would eat first, pause, and wait. Only when he lived another minute would the monarch lift his spoon. And so, amid the gold and fragrance, death itself was seated at the table, an invisible guest. To the medieval mind, food was more than sustenance, it was philosophy. The king's feast was a sermon in silver. Every course declared order, hierarchy, and the divine chain of being. The lowest servant began with crumbs, the highest noble ended with wine. Even the seating reflected cosmic order, God above, the king beneath him, and everyone else arranged by distance from both. Salt, the whitest of substances, stood at the center of the table. To sit above the salt was honor. To sit below it was shame. Dishes came in waves, each more magnificent than the last. Pheasants glazed in honey, loaves shaped into crowns, jellies dyed like jewels. But there was something unreal in it all, something theatrical. No one could truly eat that much. Half of it would rot before dawn, and yet they continued, course after course, as if abundance could chase away mortality. The splendor glittered, but beneath it pulsed unease. The king knew that every toast could be a test, every compliment a trap. Around him sat men who smiled too easily, who bowed too low, who dreamed of his throne. The feast was meant to display his control, but in truth, it revealed his isolation. He watched others eat, but his own hunger was guarded, measured. To show appetite was to seem mortal. To eat greedily was to seem weak. So he performed restraint, small bites, slow gestures, while his eyes, restless and sharp, swept the room. At the far end of the hall, jesters danced and musicians played, their songs rising like prayers into the vaulted ceiling. But even they knew, one false word, one wrong jest, and tomorrow they would be gone. The laughter was loud, the fear louder still. In a world where the poor starved, the Feast of Kings became both miracle and mockery. It was meant to prove that heaven favored the powerful, that plenty was proof of divine order. But the more the tables groaned beneath their weight, the more fragile that illusion became. Food could not mask the decay beneath the gold. Spice could not perfume away corruption. Wine could not drown the whisper that everything, even the richest, must rot. The medieval chroniclers saw it clearly. They described how, after the feast, the leftovers were scraped into the mud, where beggars fought over bones the dogs had licked. They called it the Feast of Shadows. For while the halls glittered, the streets outside were filled with silence, the same silence that had haunted the cottages of the poor. The difference was only in the color of the hunger. There is a strange stillness that comes after laughter. When the music fades and the last candle gutters out, what remains is not sound but the echo of it. So it was with the great banquets of kings. The feast would end, the nobles would retire, the servants would sweep the floor, the golden platters would be polished again, waiting for the next illusion. And yet, every banquet carried its own decay within it. Every roasted swan would turn to bone, every goblet of wine to dregs. Time eats all things. Ava Kings, Avon Glory. The chronicles that once praised these feasts now lie yellowed and brittle, their ink fading like the taste of forgotten spice. The halls themselves stand empty, their hearths cold, their tables dust. The illusion of fullness was never meant to last. Even as the king lifted his cup, he could not escape the scent of his own mortality. For beneath the perfume of saffron and cinnamon lay the sharper smell of anxiety, the awareness that his life, like the feast, depended on fragile trust. Tasters, alchemists, physicians, all hovered near him, whispering prayers and antidotes. The royal kitchens, vast as cathedrals, were laboratories of paranoia. Spices were locked in chests like jewels. Recipes were guarded as secrets of state. Once, a cook was executed for preparing too bitter a sauce. Another was rewarded with land for crafting a dish that pleased the king's melancholy mood. Food had become politics, and politics poison. As the night deepened, the king stared into his wine. The crimson surface trembled, reflecting both his face and the flames behind him. He saw not the banquet, not the laughter, but something else. The faint, unsteady shimmer of impermanence. Every feast he had ever held, every toast, every dance, had ended the same way, with ashes, silence, and sleep. The court poet once said, "Luxury is a candle that burns at both ends, it glows, then dies, leaving only smoke." End of 4. Perhaps the king understood that. Perhaps that was why his eyes seemed distant, even amid the splendor. He raised his goblet to God, to time, to all that was already gone, and drank. Midnight. The musicians had grown tired. The jesters had fallen silent. The torches burned low, dripping wax like tears. One by one, the guests withdrew, their laughter fading into the corridors. The servants cleared the bones and crumbs, their movements weary and slow. The great hall, once a world of gold and song, now stood empty. Only the candles remained, flickering in the drafts. Their light trembled across the silver, across the half-eaten bread and spilled wine relics of joy already turning to shadow. Somewhere in the distance, a dog howled. The king sat alone, the crown heavy on his brow, the scent of spice still thick in the air. He looked at the table before him, the abundance that no man could finish, and whispered, perhaps only to himself, "So this is what fullness feels like." And for the first time, he understood that fullness was another kind of hunger, one that no feast could cure. The candlelight faded. The music had long ceased. The great table symbol of power, pride, and divine right became, once again, only wood. In that silence, the echo of centuries could be heard. The peasants' prayers before their moldy bread, the monks whispering over lentils, the merchants haggling for salt, the starving crying in the dark. All of them, in their own way, had gathered here in the story of the medieval table. From ashes to silver, from famine to feast, food had mirrored the human soul. Its greed, its faith, its fear, its fragile longing to be more than dust. And now, as the last candle died, that mirror dimmed. Tomorrow, the cooks would return. The fire would be lit again. Another feast, another illusion. But for tonight, only one truth remained. Everything rots, even luxury, even laughter, kings. And in the end, all tables, peasant or royal, end in the same silence. The last crumb of bread. There is a silence that comes after history, the sound of ashes cooling, the faint scent of bread and smoke drifting from a world long vanished. But if you listen closely, beyond the clatter of swords and the rustle of robes, you can still hear it. The whisper of a wooden spoon against an iron pot, the low hum of a woman stirring hope into hunger. That sounds simple, fragile, eternal, is where civilization began. In every age, food has been more than sustenance. It has been scripture, weapon, prayer, and mirror. In the Middle Ages, it became the language through which humanity spoke to both heaven and hell. Hunger carved faith. Faith justified power. Power fed on hunger. It was an endless circle, as eternal as the wheel of seasons, as cruel as winter itself. The peasant, bent beneath the sky, prayed not for glory, but for grain. The monk fasted to purify his soul, believing that emptiness brought him closer to God. The merchant weighed sacks of flour and salt, turning scarcity into fortune. And the king, that glittering symbol of divine order, ate not out of desire, but out of fear. Each table told a story. Each meal was a reflection of where one stood in the hierarchy of creation. Bread for the poor, fish for the faithful, feast for the powerful, and silence for the forgotten. Yet, beneath all their differences, they shared the same fragile truth. Every man, woman, and child still hungered not just for food, but for meaning. To eat is to believe. To swallow is to trust. Every morsel that entered the medieval mouth carried not only flavor, but philosophy. The bread was Christ's body, the wine, his blood. A meal was communion, whether in a cathedral or a cottage. Even the poorest crumb was sacred, a reminder that the divine could dwell in something as small as grain. And so, what one ate was not just a matter of taste, but of identity. The noble's table declared privilege, the monk's bowl, devotion, the peasant's crust, endurance. Centuries would pass and the menu would change, but the ritual would not. Because every civilization, no matter how modern, still writes its soul in its recipes. When we reach for sweetness, we reveal our longing for comfort. When we hoard, we confess our fear of famine. When we share, we remember that once, in a dark winter, someone did the same for us. The medieval kitchen is gone, its hearths turned to ruins, its pots buried in museums, and yet, its ghosts live on in every meal we eat today. The bread we break, soft and white, descends from the rye loaves of the poor. The sauces we taste, rich with spice, trace their lineage to the caravans that crossed deserts for pepper and saffron. The idea of the table itself, a place of ceremony, hierarchy, and belonging, was born there. In the smoke of feasts and the silence of fasts, we no longer fear famine as our ancestors did, yet the shadow of hunger still guides our hands. We industrialized the meal, mechanized the harvest, and built empires out of appetite. We filled the world with abundance, and yet, somehow, we have never stopped craving. Fast food chains gleam like modern cathedrals, promising salvation through sugar and salt. Supermarkets overflow with choice, the kind that would have seemed divine to a medieval farmer. And still, across cities and screens, millions scroll for the next taste, the next flavor, the next comfort. Our hunger has changed its shape, but not its soul. The medieval kitchen taught us to equate eating with meaning, and in doing so, it created a civilization forever unsatisfied. If we look beyond the glitter and noise, beyond the supermarkets and glowing screens, we may find that something of the old faith still lingers, not in the churches, but in the kitchens. For what was a medieval hearth if not a temple? A place of fire, of transformation, of offering. When a woman knelt before her hearth, she was not merely cooking, she was creating. Turning the raw into the divine, the earth into nourishment, the moment into memory. Today, we light electric stoves instead of wood fires. But the act is the same. To cook is to believe that warmth can be made, that chaos can become sustenance, that life, no matter how bitter, can still be seasoned with care. That belief may be the oldest religion in the world. In medieval courts, to sit near the salt was to be near power. At modern banquets, the symbols have changed. The suit replaces the crown, the contract replaces the prayer, but the ritual endures. The table is still a map of hierarchy. The host still performs generosity. The guest still performs gratitude. And somewhere, beneath the linen and the glass, the same ancient hunger for dominance stirs. Even now, nations measure strength by what they export and consume. The empire of today is not built on swords or saints, but on sugar and grain, coffee and oil. The wars of the stomach continue quieter, subtler, but no less human. The medieval merchant, haggling for salt and spice, would understand it well, for he knew what we still refuse to admit, that food is never neutral. It is always an expression of who rules and who serves. And yet for all our progress, for all our wealth hunger has not died. It has only changed its shape. It no longer wears the face of famine, but the face of inequality. It lives in the slums, the refugee camps, the quiet corners of modern cities where food is plenty but access is not. It lives and wastes the obscene mountains of bread thrown away each day, while others starve unseen. We are haunted by abundance and starved by choice. In this way, the medieval kitchen still speaks to us, reminding us that hunger is not a relic of the past, but the foundation upon which every age is built. To understand it is to understand ourselves, because hunger, in the end, is not just a lack of food, it is the ache of the soul for justice, belonging, and grace. The king's feast is long over. The castles have turned to museums, their halls echoing with tourist footsteps. The silver has tarnished, the recipes have faded, but the illusion of fullness still tempts us. We feast as they did, not always because we are hungry, but because we are afraid of emptiness, afraid of silence, of pause, of the moment when the music stops and the candlelight reveals only our reflection. We eat to fill the void, but the void does not end, for the truth remains, every feast, no matter how grand, ends the same way with crumbs on a table and shadows on the wall. The medieval world knew this better than we do. They lived close to death, and so every meal was a prayer, every bite a reminder. They did not waste food because they understood time would waste them. We, who have forgotten the cost of hunger, might learn something from their reverence. There is a story told in the margins of an old manuscript of a monk who, during a famine, found a single crumb of bread upon the floor. He picked it up, kissed it, and placed it upon the altar. When asked why he honored something so small, he replied, "Because it is all that is left of grace." That crumb, that fragile, fleeting remnant is the true emblem of human history. Not the golden feast, not the jeweled goblet, but the last fragment of nourishment that refuses to be forgotten. It is in that crumb that all stories meet. The hunger of peasants, the prayers of monks, the fear of kings, and the hope of mothers. It is the seed of civilization itself. For only when we learned to share bread did we begin to call ourselves human. The medieval kitchen was more than a place of labor or luxury. It was the womb of the world we know. Within its smoke and fire were born our modern notions of comfort, ritual, and community. The pot that hung over the peasant's hearth became the ancestor of the modern family table. The bread blessed in church became the bread we break in peace. Even the etiquette of dining, the gestures, the gratitude, the grace, were shaped there between hunger and holiness. In its narrow space, humanity learned its greatest lesson, that to survive is not enough. We must also share, we must also remember, for in every loaf there is labor, in every feast a history, and in every hunger a reflection of our soul. Night falls over the ruins of a medieval town. The wind moves through the empty streets, carrying with it a faint, impossible scent smoke and something like bread. Perhaps it comes from a baker's ghost, still at work. Perhaps it is only memory, rising like steam from the pages of history. Either way, it lingers, because in that smell of warmth and ashes, of life and loss, the entire human story is contained. The peasant's hunger, the monk's devotion, the merchant's greed, the king's fear, all of it baked into the same eternal bread. We have changed our tools, our tables, our gods, but not our nature. We still gather around fire and food, seeking the same fragile miracle, that we may be full, if only for a moment, that we may be safe, if only until morning, that we may taste, in every crumb, the proof that life, however fleeting, is worth living. And so the circle closes. From bread to ashes, from ashes to bread again, the medieval kitchen fades, but its soul endures in every meal, every table, every act of nourishment that keeps the world turning. For as long as there is hunger, there will be faith. As long as there is fire, there will be hope. And in the smell of bread and smoke, the human story still lingers. History is served. If you've journeyed with us through the smoke and splendor of the medieval kitchen, through hunger and feast, faith and fire, then you've walked beside the very heartbeat of history. Because in the end, it wasn't kings or knights who kept civilization alive, but hands simple, scarred, steadfast that kneaded dough, stirred pots, and shared what little they had. Every empire rose on a meal. Every prayer began with bread. And every story we tell is, in its own way, a recipe for survival, for memory, for hope. So next time you sit at your table, look at what you eat. Not just the food, but the centuries behind it. The fields, the fires, the faith that made it possible. And remember, history doesn't live only in books or battles. It lingers in the warmth of a kitchen, in the taste of bread, in the hunger that still makes us human. If you've enjoyed this journey through time, leave a like, share the story, and subscribe for more tales from the past. Stories where every flavor hides a piece of who we were. Because here, in History Story, we don't just tell history. With all state,